Welcome to the Tent Talks at the Pottery Expo Warrandyte, hosted by Slow Clay Centre. Welcome back, and my name's Jane Sawyer and I run Slow Clay Centre, and we have a stall on the back of this wall if you want to find out what we do. But we basically do a lot of talks and workshops as well as classes, and that's why we're here hosting the Tent Talks at the Pottery Expo, and what a wonderful day it is today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're hosting this event on, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that it is unceded land still that we are on. I'd like to welcome our guests today. This topic today for this talk is called the Green Studio, or Greening the Studio, looking at issues of sustainability. As potters, we use a lot. We use a lot of fuel, we dig clay, we mine a lot of things. All of these things are a bit touchy, bit difficult subjects to get our heads around. So we've got a wonderful couple of people on the panel, or three people now, which is great. Welcome, Parker. And we're sadly missing one person who is Pi Bolton. Some of you may know, but she did her ankle in and is resting up. So we're very sad not to have Pi with us today. I'm going to just take Pi's place for a few minutes just to introduce how a group came about. We've got actually a little group going which is called Clay Matters, and Clay Matters happened because of a Facebook a Zoom back in one of the lockdowns, and it was hosted by the Australian Ceramics Association for the Melbourne potters and ceramic artists, and we all got together and we were all commiserating and saying what a terrible time we were having but trying to be positive, trying desperately to be positive. I said, well, isn't it great we've got clean air and there are no cars on the road, at least we can sort of breathe again, and we've got wildlife, and I live in the inner city and there's a seal in the Yarra River and there's a kangaroo jumping down my street, and so I was trying to be a little bit more positive. And then in the chat column we had all these people jumped on and said, and I sort of said, wouldn't it be great if we could just keep this happening somehow? But of course, that's a pretty difficult thing to do. But we got a little lovely group of people together just to talk and share and exchange and see where we go with all of this. It's very open-ended. So Clay Matters currently has, I think there's eight or nine of us in the group, something like that. It's a very loose group, but it is still a closed group at the moment. But at some stage we'd like to make it more public. And we have got a website that is now registered, even though it's inactive, but it's called claymatters.com.au. And at some stage, we'd invite you to jump on and check that out once we get a few things. We are in the process of making a Potter's Pledge, and also we're getting to some of the activities that we're doing is we're trying to get together deals with energy companies to use green energy and give us a group deal on that. So if we can, as potters, if we can actually garner some influence and try to get our energy all from renewable resources, it would be very beneficial. So we're working with energy companies for that. And in our pledge, we pledge to make informed, sustainable and ethical choices concerning the materials and energy required to create our work with respect for environmental consequences. As clay workers, we touch the earth every day. In the making of our functional and sculptural forms, we are connecting to billions of years of history as clay passes through our hands. So we advocate for social and cultural benefits arising from our ceramic practices and subsequently pass those on to who acquire our works for daily use and or contemplation into the future. So our active choice to work with clay carries with it a responsibility to respect the Earth's finite resources by identifying where materials are sourced how they're transported and processed, and to minimise the negative social and environmental impacts of their consumption in our studios. So that's our little group. It hopefully will become more of an active group in the future, but as I said, I just wanted to introduce it to you today. And also our panel comes from that group. So I'd like to introduce Kate Jones, who's on my immediate left. Kate is an educator and a maker. You probably know her work, beautiful sculptural forms, but she also makes functional work. Beside her, she has one of her students, Parker, and Parker Le Dupin. Yeah, did I say that right? It's a great name. So Parker will also be talking about some of the research that he's been doing with Kate in the provenance of materials and how they are mined and resourced and used. And they'll be engaging with you guys in a discussion. So we'd like as much audience participation as possible. We do have a second mic that we can pass around to people. We'll be sanitising it in between. We've got these wipes to sanitise everything. And then after their session, we've got Judith Roberts here on the far end of the panel. Judith's, you may know Judith is a very experienced educator and has these issues at the core of her work. So we'll be seeing some of her own work as well, which will be fantastic. And we'll have some images to accompany Judith's talk. So could you join me in please making our panel very welcome, and we'll hand over to Kate. And off is down, okay?
Okay, maybe I'll start standing up. Make it more serious. Okay. So this is just an open discussion, as Jane said, and if we don't necessarily have to wait for questions at the end. So if anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment or turn this into a discussion, that would be great. The Provenance Project, which is the project that I'm talking about today, is something that's to the side of my normal practice and that came out of the lockdown last year. But the lockdown last year was not actually the starting point for this. It was building up in the year or two before the lockdown, a sort of creeping awareness of just where we are with climate change, basically, and then the sort of summer of the bushfires. Coming back into the studio after the bushfires, it felt like that had to be recognised in the teaching and in practice. So before the lockdown of the pandemic, we had this really intense term where we started to try to make some objects that talked about the environment. So we made some oyas, which are water pots that are porous and can be put into the ground to hold water in the ground. And it sort of just meant that we could talk a lot about the environment, basically, about the need to have permeable surfaces in architecture, to look after bees, all those kind of conversations came out of that. And also those forms had a provenance back into ancient forms and more humble, probably female-based ceramics, actually, like earthenware pots from India and Africa. And so it was a way to talk about those kind of things in a studio where we're often doing high-fired ceramics, which is... So revaluing those more traditional techniques was really important at that time. And then the lockdown happened, and this response to what was happening in the world through the making was no longer an option for a little while. And for me, I was not only not teaching, but I didn't have a studio. So for the first time in about 12 years, I had an extended period of time where I wasn't making. And as potters, as Jane said, we're always working with the earth. It sort of keeps us grounded. We feel like we're doing something, we're in touch with something. And that was taken away for a while. So I grabbed the opportunity to I just happened to be able to leave the city for a couple of months and spend a couple of months on my own for the first time in my life, actually, in the country. And I thought that I would go up there and do a whole lot of reading and drawing and the sort of stuff that I love to do but I don't have a lot of time for, but which is part of my idea of what my practice is. But I got up there and I did do some reading and I did do some drawing, but I guess because of the particular times that we're in, I spent a lot of time just walking around in the bush, in the country. I was on Judgell Warren country up in central Victoria in the goldfields. And a lot of time just walking around looking at my feet and looking at the ground and thinking about the materials that we use in our practices. So in terms of a sustainable practice, there's a whole lot of issues around how we manage our studios and how we recycle our clay and where our energy comes from and how we package things and how we send them out. But I started thinking about provenance. The word provenance kept coming into my mind, and I started thinking about how we have to actually think, I had to think more about where the materials that I was using came from. And that led to a realisation. I think I cook a lot, and I really understand this idea about bringing your children up to know where the food comes from and growing food and knowing that a potato grows in the ground and the importance of that connection and knowing what the whole cycle of things is. And I realised that in my ceramic practice, even though I've been doing it for a long time, well, actually, it feels like a short time to me, but to other people it seems like a long time. It's only 12 years. But anyway, but doing it full time for 12 years really and studying a lot, I actually didn't know. I started to sort of have these conversations with students and peers, and I realised that I actually didn't know what clay was. Like if somebody asked me what the definition of clay was, I just got a good definition yesterday after talking about Provenance Project for months. I went to visit my dad yesterday and the conversation was a bit short, and I started looking through his Encyclopaedia Britannica, old paper, flesh and blood book, and I found a really good description of what clay is, which I might share later, but it's not important. But what was important was... Okay, all right. So what I've come to after months of thinking about these things is clay is a material that has a micron size less than a particular size, which I can't off the top of my head tell you what it is. But so it's very small particles, but it also has to be able to hold water in a particular way, and that's what, we do the test. If you find something on the ground, you make a coil, you bend it. If it bends and it doesn't crack, it's clay because it's plastic. I guess that's like a really hands-on layman's kind of test. But I think these fine particles, they have to be able to hold water in a certain way, and they exchange ions in a particular way. They're open in the way that they... Anyway, can't get more technical than that. But basically clay is something that acts like clay. So clay is actually a description of a behaviour, and there are a whole lot of different minerals that act like clay. Different structures. Halloysite is different from kaolin, is different from... Anyway... I didn't know this stuff. I didn't know... I'd done a little bit of kind of understanding of the chemical analysis of clay and glazes because we find those things out because we want to manipulate them and use them. But I didn't understand the geology, and I didn't understand the relationship between materials. I only found out last week that rutile was titanium. I'm just like... it's just endless. So... Thinking about all those things, I realised, for example, that feldspar is one of the most common things on the earth. It's like, just means field rocks. And I don't know what it looks like. It comes into the studio in big paper sacks, and some of the paper sacks say where things come from and some don't really. And I sort of thought, well, if I was making a new glaze, and I had a choice between a potash feldspar and a soda feldspar, I wouldn't know if one of them had been shipped all the way from Canada and one came from just up the road, and I wouldn't know enough to make like a really simple decision that might just be a little bit environmentally more friendly. So I just started to feel like a responsibility to find out these things. So the starting point for that seemed to be to this walking around, looking at my feet and looking at rocks on the ground, and then picking rocks up and taking them back to the house and trying to work out what they were, and then having these kind of conversations with people about, like, I just found out what clay is, or I just found a piece of feldspar, and that was really exciting, and it started making me think about geology. And I started reading about geology, which at the moment, we had the pandemic last year. I hear a lot of people saying, thank God 2020 is over, let's get back to normal. It doesn't seem to me like that's an option, really. And there's a whole lot of talking and writing and information that connects the idea of geology and deep time to ways that we can think about where we are at the moment. So we really, like, our attention spans are often very short. So we look at what we're doing in the studio, but we don't connect that. And I think Judith is going to talk about the obligation not only to look at where your materials come from, but to think about where your work is going to go into the world, and that obligation to be adequate to the materials that you're using and the resources that are. Clay is not a renewable new resource, really. You know, everything is limited and everything is really precious, actually. So we did that, spent my 2 months on my own, came back to town, a bit lonely doing all this reading and talking to myself and doing little funny Instagram posts with poems about limestone, and had gone down that whole wormhole. So I started talking to a group of peers and students, associates, people, about what would be other ways that we could look at the world as potters when we're not making stuff. So it doesn't happen often that you get this disruption where you're still thinking like a potter and using the knowledge that you have as a potter, because that's who I am and that's where I come from. But thinking about the ways that we know the world. So we deal with chemistry all the time, and we deal with bodily knowledge, and we deal with intuition, and we deal with fire and physics and all sorts of poetry. We were making art, and what is that for? What's the purpose of things? So I started thinking a lot about context and purpose. And context for me is connecting things back and forwards and sideways more deeply. And there's a term that Donna Haraway uses. She talks about thickening the present. So there's this idea of deep geological time and being able to see things with a longer perspective, which I find useful in thinking about where we are now and where we're going to go in the future, and sort of making sure that things are taken into consideration. But also this idea of thickening the present is like, it's not just what I'm going to make now to make some money for next week. It's like, what are the other connections that are happening? And just, where do things come from and where do they go? And putting things into a different timescale. So we got together, this group, and we decided to go back out onto Dja Dja Wurrung country to look for some materials. We had this idea of looking for this metallic oxide. Well, actually, to be honest, we were looking for cobalt, because we thought, as potters, what's a thing that... There's a whole lot of terrible issues associated with cobalt and its mining in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I don't actually use it much myself, but it seemed like I'm trying to think of that word we use, like when we use a panda or a tiger to represent all lesser animals because they're more charismatic. It seemed like a charismatic material to go and look for. So we did some research about where we might find it, and it seemed like a fun thing to do. So we went away for a weekend. Before that, this context and these connections, I sent an email to the local land council, and it's really tricky. People have asked me, were you asking permission to go and find minerals on the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung people? And I didn't do that because I do things on the land of Indigenous people every day that are more harmful probably than picking up a few discarded rocks. It's very, very tricky. But what I did do is just try to open the possibility of a conversation about how how they feel because they do a lot of active management up in this area that I'm talking about, how they feel about people coming in and different projects, because they are seeking to be consulted in bigger projects that are happening. Anyway, I didn't get an answer because they do have bigger projects than me and a couple of people going to look for some rocks one weekend. But we kind of did our due diligence and decided that we would go and fossick on land that had already been mined, which is not hard up there. It's a very upside-down mined country and everything's churned and turned over, and it hasn't been repaired since the gold rushes. It's very jumbled. Anyway, we went up and we did some clay activities. We dug clay out of a dam and we made an oven and we cooked food wrapped in clay, and we sat around the campfire and talked about cobalt and the fact that the word cobalt comes from the word for goblin and all sorts of mythological connections. And the next day we set out and we actually found some material, which actually I should have bought a piece. We found some material that we thought looked interesting, and we took that back and we crushed it up. We had the test kiln up there. We had a little test kiln, yeah. We crushed it up straight away and put it on a little pot and put it through a test kiln. The next morning, and we sat around the fire again and talked about, we were all like, we'd been in a gold rush. We were so excited. We'd found this mysterious thing that looked metallic. And we got up in the morning and we looked in the test kiln and it didn't really look blue, but we'd done it in a rush and we weren't sure what we had. Anyway, then we went to visit an abandoned iron mine, and Parker's in a minute going to go off on a tangent, because this is what the Provenance Project has become. It's a kind of just a resting place for a whole lot of different threads of conversation. But before I get Parker to talk about the iron, we came back, we'd done this stuff. We got invited, just coincidentally, to do a residency at a place in Brunswick called Study, which is run by Enda Baskin and Sophie Morehouse Morris and a committee. And I'm just going to read like one paragraph out of their manifesto, because this idea of research and study is really... Their manifesto is beautiful. They've got a website if you look it up. But this idea of study is really important to me. So this is one paragraph out of their manifesto. We call it study. It's a verb and a noun, a practice we do and a place to be. The idea is that study happens everywhere, anytime, not just in a uni or school or library. In fact, those places of governance often suppress and deny study in its fullest sense. Study is active. It is not only reading, but it is planning, scheming, playing, doing. It is theory and practice. It is self-directed and it is social. It is a crucial way of being together and of feeling good. Study is what we do when we come together on our terms rather than theirs. So it was a really beautiful invitation, and we went in there and we basically did what they were talking about doing. We took everything from a library of books to drawing materials, and we got people to come in and make poems. We took a little test kiln and some mortar and pestles and some found clay, and we went and found clay in the neighbourhood, and it was supposed to be a 2-week residency. We had 2 weeks of really intense, like 6-day-a-week long days in there, just going, what if we do this? And what if we do that? And we got our material, our cobalt, and we got it to go blue, and we were over the moon, and we had an open day, and we had people coming in for conversations. Quite a few people here came in at different times, and it was amazing. It was really great. So I'm just going to get Parker to just give you a snippet of the kind of way that goes.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to stay seated, if that's agreeable. The Provenance Project has been really exciting. We have definitely got some results out of some of the things that we've found, but to be honest, it hasn't been about that at all. Like, the finding the blue was very exciting. Absolutely, couldn't believe it. Wasn't expecting it. I don't know how it happened. Even I don't understand, and we still don't even know what that material is. We're waiting for an analysis. But I think the most exciting things that have been happening in that specific residency space, but then also as an extension of that, is the conversations with people that have come in. And really that's what the Provenance Project has been about, is having conversations, not about finding a product or answers to anything in particular, but just having the conversations and kind of sitting with some of the things that we find. And these conversations, they can get really technical, they can get really uncomfortable, and it's not just for people that have been making ceramics for many, many years. I'm very new, I'm a student, and I feel like it's a space for everyone to be involved in, to look into the specifics of certain materials, history, and etc. So I just wanted to give an example of some of the things that we've been talking about. We actually, I want to talk about iron. We actually didn't end up really talking much about iron in the space. Well, we did a little bit.
We had so many different, like, not that, what percentage? Maybe half the people came in were potters, and the other people were writers or drawers or other kind of researchers. And we did have a lovely thing where someone called Edie Bush came in, and she's just got actually some books being published this week. She's a drawer, cartoonist drawer, and she did come in, and we had this lump of iron, and she fell in love with it and did drawings. And anyway,
taking too long. Okay. Yep, I'll be quick. Sorry. So being outside of the studio and having that time to look into materials has been invaluable. So, for example, with iron, I think iron is a material that most potters have some kind of relationship, whether it's in your bodies or glazes or decorative. And iron has a really incredible history in Australia. We have a lot of iron in Australia, and a lot of iron in art, like in ancient cave paintings. Red ochre is in like most cave paintings. A more recently discovered kangaroo found in Balangara country, painted in red ochre, dated to have been painted about 17,300 years ago. So, iron has been present in our work as people for a very long time. And the thing is about red ochre is that it's a clay pigmented by hematite, which is a pigment that contains iron oxide. So iron oxide being the word that we often talk about, that we use. I feel like I'm just going to skip through quite a lot of this because we're running out of time. So one of the first iron mines in Australia opened up in 1857, which is on the west bank of the West Moorabool River at Lala, which is the place, incidentally, that we visited, which was a coincidence, I guess, but very interesting. And iron is I guess it's the most mined mineral, which is the hematite, which is in red ochre, which contains 69.9% iron. So that is the most mined iron ore in Australia. And Australia has the world's largest estimated reserves of iron ore with 52 billion tonnes of iron being mined in Australia. And it's the largest source of export revenue, worth $63 billion in 2017, and that has increased since then. So Australia has an incredible mining history and continues to be the case. And it gets even more complicated because, as you're probably aware of, mining companies are well known for destroying ancient Indigenous sites. Last year, BHP claimed that it would go ahead with destroying at least 40 ancient Indigenous sites in the Pilbara Desert in Western Australia, and they received approval to go ahead to expand their iron ore mine worth $3.2 billion on land that contains rock shelters 15,000 years old with cave paintings with red iron ochre. So the more you talk about these things, the more complicated it gets, and there isn't an answer. And there is a stark contrast between our country's reliance on mineral extraction and the current long overdue emerging awareness of structural racism. And it's hard to figure out how we fit in. And there isn't an answer to that question. But the conversations, they need to happen. And we're having them within the Provenance Project, and come and speak with us about it. Yeah, sorry.
Thanks, Parker. Can I just butt in and say, how would anyone engage with those conversations in a practical way with you?
Is it the Provenance? Sorry, is it the Provenance Project or theprovenanceproject.com? If you have a look at it, there's some images. There's not much else there, but there are contact things, and we're hoping that that website will be a place where people can make submissions of writing, but also it's a little bit like our group. It's sort of evolving, and we'll be doing more things, but who knows what it is. And the difficulty of this is then how you go back into your own practice and how you make, once you turn your attention to these really tricky issues, how do you then... And I think that's what Judith's going to talk about, and the really important role of art. And
Thank you, Kate and Parker. Thank you so much.
I have to stand up. Thank you.
And handing over to Judith Roberts. I'm sorry we've had to cut short, but we do have a time limit. But I think you'd probably agree these issues are very, very complex. But I'm really excited by what you're doing, and I think it's a fabulous thing to be doing. And very, very overdue. Thank you so much. Handing over to Jude now. Maybe Kate and Jude, if you swap. No, because you need the screen.
I was happy to stand on the side. Okay.
Move the chair if you want to stand, and then get close to the screen because we've got cameras.
Yeah, I've got a few images to show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate and Parker, for getting us the ball rolling on material questions. I've got a lot of grey hair on my head, but I would like to direct you to some resources that would help you that are connected to the history of ceramics, like some of our Potter's dictionaries and so forth, like the Hamer. We'll answer some of your questions about feldspar and so forth, and not to diminish what you've just said, but marry the two, and you'll find that will help you leap along, especially your questions about iron as well, the different kinds of iron and so forth. And don't forget those resources are there. I think it's valuable to do new, fresh looking, absolutely, and I'm sure you have been looking, but some of your questions you're posing to yourself can be answered relatively quickly in some of those resources. The Hamer Dictionary of Potter's Material... Hamer and Hamer, sorry, thank you, Janet. Hamer and Hamer, Dictionary of Potter's...
Just can't forget Janet Hamer.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Just if you start with that, you'll find it's a Potter's Dictionary, okay? And it's absolutely... I still use it all the time.
It is a fabulous...
All the time, yeah. I bought mine online. It's very widely available. It's been republished. It's not a problem, but as part of the resource, this project, I think, use it as part of it, yeah. Of course, yeah, okay. Anyway, back to me. I thought could you put the first slide up, please? I'm changing the name of my presentation to Critical Choices and Heart Work, because I started out thinking really what I want to stand here and say. Oh, is that better? Sorry. I've decided to call my talk Critical Choices and Heart Work rather than Greening the Studio, although that's the subheading, because I initially thought I was going to say, actually, this is a talk about good news and bad news, and I think we have to live with some of those dichotomies in our practice. And it's normal, I think, if presented with the idea of good news or bad news, we often want the bad news first, saving the good news for later. So I thought I'd start with the bad news or the critical choices that we need to make. And we have an enormous enthusiasm for our material, and we get wildly keen to get on with making and doing in all sorts of different ways. And sometimes that drives us past important questions that we should be asking about the impact that we have in our studios, please. This is my very modest little firing setup. I have a 9 cubic foot kit kiln and... Oh, yeah, is that better? Sorry about that. Thank you. And a very small electric kiln. That's what I work with at home. I've worked with these kilns for all the years that I've practiced. I was spoilt being a teacher at TAFE and had access to an enormous and luxurious kiln suite of 9 different kinds of kilns. So I was royally spoilt. But these are the kilns that I work in. And initially I made mid-fired tableware using the gas kiln there, and then larger pieces using the big kiln for raku processes. Why I'm showing you my little kiln suite there is that this little modest setup had me thinking about my own carbon footprint and the amount of energy that I put through these kilns over the years, and my raku firing practice. For about 15 years I offered workshops in raku firing and made work myself from, maybe we'll have the next slide, using small bin kilns like this. I had several that I would take along to workshops and fire using LP gas. And only recently have I actually sat down and done the maths on how much CO2 a single 9 kilo gas bottle generates at a workshop. And one 9 kilo gas bottle generates 20 kilos of CO2. It's a simple piece of maths that you can do. And so therefore my other kiln, which I fire with 45 kilo gas bottles, do the maths. There's a lot of CO2 each time I'm emptying those bottles in firings. And that doesn't even begin to account for the energy embedded in the materials that went to make my kiln, the processing that went to make my clay, the energy that was burnt in engines in trucks and planes and boats to get my materials to me from wherever the provenance of various materials have come from. So I had a really, I believe, really big footprint from a practice, and I was disregarding it until relatively recently. In fact, not long before joining in with the Play Matters group, actually. I actually sat down and did that maths quite recently. And I'm embarrassed about that. But then I think I'm an example of all of you who practice in ceramics in that we've got this massive enthusiasm to make and create, and we try and work safely and we try and work without wasting things, but we do blindside ourselves with some of this stuff. And so I just thought I'd put that out there. I did adjust my practice. I stopped giving the workshops, and I'm right here to tell you I didn't stop doing the workshops because of my carbon footprint. I couldn't physically do it anymore. I just stopped. So I sort of ceased that practice, 15 years worth. But I was, during the second part of that 15 years, doing quite a lot of work for myself using raku, making very small series of work. And I'd like to present that as an example of one way I unwittingly greened my studio, in that by making a small range of work, a small series of work, editing very carefully, and not firing anything that wasn't absolutely just right, because with raku you fire things one at a time, so you have every opportunity to say, no, I'm not going to fire this, it's not good enough. I think that part of my practice was a greener approach to my studio. I was still using fuel, I was still using materials, I was making a lot less. Sorry, I'm not very good with this microphone. Sorry about it. Yeah, okay. I was making a lot less, and so unwittingly I was achieving something in my studio that I only now reflect on at this point. But I'm saying it to you now so that maybe you can do something a bit better than I did at that point. So this is all part of the critical choices side of the ledger. I'd also like to say something a bit heretical to those of you here practising ceramics. I think we all get a bit smug about our approach to recycling. I think whenever issues of sustainability are brought up, we sort of very quickly inside ourselves, we may not even say it, but we say, oh, but that's okay, we are wonderful, we ceramists, we take our material and we recycle every last bit. Well, good for us, I say. But if you actually do the maths, and if you were paying attention a minute ago to my calculations of fuel for firing, no amount of recycling is going to get anywhere near offsetting that particular part of the environmental footprint of a ceramic studio. So by all means recycle, but I think put aside that sort of self-pat on the back about that being the be-all and end-all and it's all good to go. Be aware of every part of our practice, I say. There's a list of words that start with R that I recommend that we all embrace to our best ability. Recycle, of course, is right at the top of that, and we should recycle everything that we possibly can within the studio. And I work at Slow Clay, and every last scrap of clay seems to go back into the system all the time, and there's just so little waste there. Recycle everything, repurpose things. If you've got lots of different clays in your studio, put them together and make a new clay and do something with it. Nothing should go to the tip. Reuse things, reuse your equipment, your tools, your setup, your everything. Reuse, repurpose whenever you can within your studio. Reflect on what you do all the time. What am I really doing here? Am I actually advancing my thinking and my practice, or am I just mucking around? I think a bit of mucking around's okay, but I think one thing I see with a lot of ceramists is an overwhelming drive to learn a new process. Let's go and do another workshop in this. I've just seen somebody doing that. Let's do something in that. I think learning things is great, but I think at the same time we need to be growing and coming to understand what we're actually doing with our own work and not rushing around, just expending energy and materials and what have you, playing to an extent that really doesn't necessarily contribute to your practice. It's a heretical thing to say because I've been a bit guilty of that myself, but I think I've had to talk to students, and I see some of them here now, about their enthusiasm. Why can't we do a lustre workshop now? Why can't we do this? I want to learn about porcelain. I want to work. Well, actually, you haven't got time to do all those things just now. What is it you actually want to do, and how do you want to use those materials or processes? And I think that's a harder question, and I think it gets jumped over in an enthusiasm for more and more workshops and, sort of technical learning. So I've been a bit blunt and a bit brutal in this part of my talk. I'll finish this first bit by saying I think we need to abolish two words in our studio practice. One of them is waste. Try very hard not to use the word waste. Instead, try and find another word like repurpose or reuse or something. Materials oughtn't to be wasted, and especially when listening to ideas of provenance of materials, I think we should honour the materials by finding some kind of appropriate destination for them. And the other word is away. There's no such place as away, so if you throw something away, that's a cop-out. So I think again, those two words should go and should be an active part of how you see your practice in the studio. All right, so I'm going to move on from being blunt and a bit brutal in my presentation. I haven't moved the slides along because I've been not paying attention. Could we have a look at something else? Here we are. This is me just recombining different clays. And the next one, Jane. And we need them back into whatever, to make something. And again, this is some of my finished raku pieces. When I fired this work, that is a very large piece, about that big. I fired it by itself in my 9 cubic foot kiln at an angle because it was the only way to actually fire it, and I lifted it out with hooks and then did the raku thing with it. So I wasn't filling my kiln to the brim. You can't do it with raku. And so just to give you another little backstory on that practice. Next one. I played a lot with ideas of shape and space, sort of abstract concerns, changing the identity of a volume from being a container to simply being a contained space with interruptions, holes and additions. And then the last part of my raku practice, I made a lot of biomorphic shapes where I was exploring the idea of the inner volume of a vessel becoming some kind of energy pressing out. A lot is said about this, about fulsome vessels thrown on the wheel that are appear to press out against the skin of the clay. I teach a lot of life drawing, and one of the mantras about life drawing is our bodies, even as we age, everything from within is pushing out against our skin, and I like the idea of that lively, contained volume, and so the Biomorphic series was about that. And next, I made some tableware, a very modest sweep of tableware in mid-fire of these assembled but pieces that were made for purpose, serving surfaces and so forth. I'd like to invite you all to stop calling your work functional, by the way. It's a particular... Yeah, I see some laughter in the crowd. Don't call your work functional. Call it something else. Find some other language to describe what it does if it serves a purpose. A garden hose is functional, but, you know, a platter is a serving surface, or a teacup is a beverage holder. Find something else to call it than a functional item. Next one. Well, exactly. When there's an actual physical purpose, find another word. And of course, Jane makes the point. And here I am. I hit a wall with my practice and decided that I would have a whole rethink and try and find a new centre for what I wanted to make my work about. And I went back to uni and I did an MFA, and I used clay, but I did not make, it wasn't ceramics as the final destination. I got more involved in the ideas of labour, the sort of labour and rhythms that we partake in every day for everything, not just art making, but our daily life is filled with reiterative tasks that we have to do over and over again. And when we're learning something, we have to do things over and over again. And that repetition and labour is kind of forgotten when we've made the final piece. And so I made some work that was about that rhythm of making. Next one. I made some videos that were to highlight that sometimes tedium of doing things over and over. We need to be in that space of repetition to learn things. And I was very pleased, I have to say, with my 4 minutes and 52-second video of all these pieces just landing on top of each other in a pile. They started out life being all the same or near enough to being the same, and ended up being completely modified by the disruptive action of throwing them down on the pile. Okay. So what am I saying? What am I saying with some of this? What I'm really trying to say to you is there are reasons to make your ceramics that really haven't got anything to do with just using up resources. When we go into our studio, our purpose is not to just use up resources, use up energy, waste things. That's not what we're there for. We're in there to make things that serve us as makers, that will later on affect and serve somebody else, or trigger thinking in somebody else. Like, we have got a very important role when we go into our studios and begin to make things and strive to make things well, whether it doesn't matter what it is, but if we're going after something in our studios, we are serving ourselves first by reflecting on our reason to make. We then make things that we then fledge from the studio or show to the world. It doesn't even have to be a transaction involved, just showing it to the world. And we hope, it will happen, people will reflect on what we make and do. So we are making a contribution to the richness of somebody else's lives as well as our own by what we do in the studio. I think everybody here who has been spending any time making will know that thing when you've spent all afternoon pinching a series of pinch pots or something, and you pick them up again and again and keep evolving them, and you keep looking at their profile, and eventually there's one that just sings and you think, wow, look at that. I think in those moments you've done something to yourself. You've sort of nurtured your creative self. Then if you line up your best pinch pots, whatever it is you've been making, and you show them to other people, and they reach out their hand and pick it up, and they hold it or put it to their lips and drink a beverage from it or something, they are experiencing or going into your space to enjoy what you thought when you were making, or at least some of it anyway. So that parcel, you've inserted some essential qualities of yourself into the items that you've made that are then passed on to others when they look at or use or whatever those pieces. And every time somebody else picks up your piece or uses it or has a drink of coffee out of it or whatever, they will have that thing happen to them again. I've got items in my cupboards at home that have names attached to them. The Lena Jacobson beaker. The Lena Jacobson jug, actually. I must just correct myself there. These things have titles, you know. So a little bit of her is in the jug, the one that I want for such and such, whatever it is. Don't underestimate this. This is sort of cultural capital that has been launched out into the world by you, making thoughtful work in your practice. So how does all of this contribute in any way to greening your studio? I say that you, by making work carefully, developing a very powerful critical eye, meaning that you go early at your wear board or whatever and you say, that piece is not good enough, back in the bin. Everybody can do it. A beginner can look along a wear board and, if asked, identify the best piece on the board. So you already have a critical eye from the start. Everyone needs to use it from the start. And I suggest that people in the mature end of their career, and myself included, I think we need to do the same thing and challenge ourselves even harder. What am I doing? Why do I need to make another one of these? How can I make this better? How can I make the next better iteration of this, whatever it is? And then that parcel of your essential contribution to your work travels with that work to wherever that work ends up. As I say this, I can almost hear people's minds going, oh my God, but it's so hard to get your work out there. It's very, very difficult to sustain yourself professionally. Of course it is, absolutely is. But the sale is only one part of a professional practice. At this expo, people are wandering around, hundreds of people are wandering around, and there are people buying a pot here or something there. Most people go home with one or two things or nothing. All the rest, and those people that have gone home with one thing, two things or nothing, will have also swept their eyes across everything else that's here and have taken home a flavour of what it is to be a creative person and make cultural capital items for the world. So I think being part of something, looking at objects and artworks, acquiring them, living with them, and understanding their essential quality is the way to green your studio, because you'll actually make a bit less and you'll perhaps charge a bit more for them, but you'll understand what you're doing most of all. And we won't hear any of that grumpy stuff about how hard it all is, because people will be feeding their souls appropriately. I think I'll stop there, because we're being played out by the musicians next door.
Thank you. Thanks, Judith. Yes, we have hit, thank you so much, we have hit 10 past 12. We were supposed to... Oh, yours. Maybe let's turn yours.
Move it away.
We have hit 10 past 12 and we were supposed to finish at 12, but and that's because the band is going to start up now. So we do have a little... We could sing as they've stopped. We could actually have some questions. Does anybody have a question for either Kate, Parker or Judith? I think we've had an amazing kind of spread of ideas this morning, challenging ideas for all of us. But if you have a question, stick your hand up. Cinda.
Hi, Judith. I was wondering, when you said stop calling your work functional, why? What were you suggesting? Were you suggesting the word functional diminishes the work at all?
So that last one again.
Were you suggesting that the word functional diminishes the work?
Yes, I think it's a blunt, unpoetic word, quite honestly. And I think it's, of course, we're not, a teacup does serve a function. I've just challenged, I've got students here who've heard me say it over and over, find something else to say. You don't have to just lump all of what you do. If you make domestic tableware or something, don't call it functional tableware or something. Call it, domestic tableware is better than functional objects or something. And also find a longer sentence, I love to make work that I can imagine people eating their ramen noodles out of. And I think when you go around to a stand, that's what we should be saying. Not, I make functional work. No, it's not a very attractive word, that's all.
What would you say to me? I make non-functional wear.
I enjoy navigating, exploring ideas in my work. And that's what I do now.
I call it abstract sculptural forms.
Well, do that, but then say more.
Yep.
So, say more about your ideas. In your abstract sculptural forms, where are the references coming from? You know, in my case, it was the human body. So say more. Just say more. People don't get it, you know. Yes, Janet.
Can I ask what you call yourself?
I do call myself an artist now, or a ceramic artist. I don't know, I stubbed my toe on it a bit. And I didn't like calling myself a potter, even though I made a lot of pots. I did call myself a ceramist back then, the short word. Nobody likes that word. Yeah, but I'd probably call myself an artist, really, if I had to be nailed to the wall. But I do use clay and the world of clay, and I'm very happy to make long sentences when I talk about that. And I think that's what I'm asking you to say, is to just don't put just a blunt heading on it. Find more words. Yes, but don't bury people. I mean, I'm guilty of, you know, getting big language going. I'd like to look at someone's face and talk to them so they understand. And I believe I can talk to anybody if they're asking me a question. And I have moved people along, you know, when they've said, I don't know what this is. Why have you, like the closed forms that you can't put a flower in and that kind of thing. Well, I'll just love it. If I get a question like that, happy birthday, because I'm really interested in it and I talk about it and I see, do you understand what that means? And da-da-da-da-da. And then the life of the work is that instead of holding a cup each morning, your work will sit and people's eyes will rest as my eyes rest on works that are artworks in my house. And as I go by, I'm reminded of the artists, the ideas, and that fills my cup, so to speak.
Thank you. Thanks for a great question too. Any other questions? Any other thoughts, contributions, tricky issues?
Hi. Just to you guys, do you have in mind writing down a list with like sustainable and ethical materials to use within Australia as a potter? Has a guidance?
We actually, at the very beginning of the Provenance Project and the Clay Matters discussion,
The question was, sorry.
did we have in mind writing down a list of the more ethical materials? That was a thought at the beginning, but it became more about not looking for those quick answers because the materials change all the time. And you can make a list, and maybe at some point we'll put a list on the website, but actually just individuals asking those questions from their suppliers or just thinking about it a bit more is not that complicated. So it's not about giving answers, it's just about asking questions, really.
It's a very tricky thing, isn't it, with materials too, because with Australian suppliers, and Janet, you would probably have a lot of knowledge that, you know, our industry is small and big. You know, there's a kind of small demand for certain products and then they source them from everywhere. But if we put pressure on our suppliers, they're not necessarily going to be able to find materials locally, even if we want them. But it still behoves us to do that,
It
doesn't
does. And something interesting that has happened since we've begun this Provenance Project in the studio that I teach in at School of Clay and Art, we've been asking more and more questions about different kinds of clay bodies and what they're made out of and so on. And actually now we're starting to buy more materials dry in bags and mixing clay or blending them with plastic clays and getting rid of some of that plastic bags and some of that
And the
stuff and
heavy
getting local
transport.
materials.
Yeah.
So, and that works.
Transport.
Yeah.
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 So you're not transporting water anymore.
No,
Yeah.
and we've been, you know, finding materials that are sourced from places we know, like Rowsley and Ararat, and yeah.
We do at Slow Clay too. We have a very local in the sense that it's South Australia, but it's a clay that's dug straight out of the ground.
Oh, the Bennett's beautiful. Yeah,
straight out of the ground.
Yeah,
And so
unprocessed. It's
yeah.
like,
well, it's processed, it's filter
But
pressed,
it's
but it's not
less processed.
blended with
Yeah.
any other clays. So it's a great thing,
Yeah.
to be able to do that, and it's good to source that.
yeah, and it is possible with a bit of thought. Yeah.
Any others?
Just one question that someone's asked on the feed. I think this may be for Judith. But is there a formula for finding your carbon footprint?
Yes, you can go online and find all sorts of calculators that can help you work out your carbon footprint. But that calculation for LP gas to how much CO2, I think you multiply the kilos by 2.2, and it's a simple relationship because the LP gas is I can't think of the formula for it just at the moment, but every carbon molecule that comes off during combustion is bound with 2 oxygen, hence CO2, and so it's a 2.2 ratio for that one. But go online for many different calculators, very good ones that you can work out your carbon footprint. And you can isolate it from your studio, from your household as well.
That's a great question. Yes, we can do that. We can put some of those resources up on yeah. Any other questions quickly before we're finishing? No? All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panel. It was really, really stimulating to hear all those ideas. Thank you so much. Anyone who wants to hang back and ask questions, do so. We have another talk at 2 p.m. With 2 artists, Janet Debus, right here in front of me, who is going to be talking about the International Academy of Ceramics and her work, and Sally Walk, who hasn't arrived yet, will be also talking about her work and some of the ideas and the concepts behind it. And the IAC... Very little. Janet's just saying very little about her work and more about the IAC. But just a reminder, the IAC, the International Academy of Ceramics exhibition, is down halfway down and slightly to the left under a big tent that looks like this. Very worthwhile going to. And support your local potter. Go around, find people's work that you love. Cinda, did you have a quick... Yes, all the talks are being streamed live as we do them, but we're also recording them, and we'll have that available on the Pottery Expo website eventually, and maybe Slow Clays as well. That might take a bit more time. We've got to edit them. But the live streaming is on our Instagram at Slow Clay Centre, and Pottery Expo, I don't think they're live streaming. It's just us, isn't it? Yep. Okay. Thanks, everyone, all over again. Thank you for coming.